Hello, grade 9s. In this next unit of business economics, we're going to look at three things and how they work together. The three things are supply, demand, and price. You can actually spend months and even years of your life studying these concepts, and there'll be a lot of resources available online. But we're going to start in grade 9 with some baby steps. Our objective is to understand some basic terms, the terms supply, demand, a market, and equilibrium. We're going to try to understand in this lesson how supply and demand can change over time, and we're going to try to predict the impact a situation has on supply and demand. Starting with some very, very basic terms that we should all know. A market is pretty obvious. If we think of the markets in town or places that we shop, it's a place where things can be bought and sold. It's important to remember as well that a market now can exist not only in the physical world, but it can also be online, just like some of the biggest companies in the world, such as Amazon. The second term is also very easy but hard to find in the real world, and the term is equilibrium. Equilibrium is going to be a situation where we have a balance in supply and demand. And the market, when this happens, when things are in equilibrium, is going to be very, very happy. Moving to some more difficult concepts. The first one we want to talk about is demand. Demand has two components that are very, very important. It's not just wanting something. It also means that if you want it, that you can afford to buy it. So let's take three examples. The example of broccoli as a product, a phone as a product, and a Ferrari as a product. Demand is often very personal, but it can be determined by fads or other movements within culture. But let's use my personal preference as an example. I hate broccoli. I've taught my children to hate broccoli, which means that I don't want it. Therefore, there's a low demand for broccoli in my life and in my household. It doesn't mean, though, if I have no other food that I won't someday want it. If we move on to phones, most of us want phones. I certainly want a phone to communicate and to be able to do my work and to be able to do all sorts of other social interactions. So you can say there's a demand for phones in my household because I want them, and I can afford almost any phone unless it's ridiculously priced or crusted in diamonds and rubies. Yes, you can get those too. Moving on to a Ferrari, a car that many people would like, but not exactly me. It's a nice car, but I just can't afford the payments on a Ferrari. This means it also represents a low demand in my household, because even though I might want it, I cannot afford it. So to recap, demand is affected by what we want and whether or not we can afford it. Moving on to supply. Supply is pretty easy to understand at first glance. Supply is literally how much of something there is to buy. But it's determined by two different factors. First, the quantity that is available, so how much is available, but also the second part, which becomes a bit more complicated, how easily is that product available, all right? Can I go and buy it at any shop? Is it even for sale in certain countries like South Africa? These determine the supply of a good. Using another three products as examples, we can better understand supply. In terms of the first example, diamonds have two interesting issues. The first is that the number of them available on the market at any time is controlled. Secondly, diamonds can only be purchased at certain shops. You can't go to Pick n Pay or Checkers and get a diamond. You have to go to a jewelry store. So this means that the supply of diamonds tends to be low. If we look at the next product, maize meal. Maize meal is a common product. It's easily available. You can buy it almost anywhere, including petrol stations, and you can buy it in large quantities. So it means there is a high supply of maize meal on the market. Finally, if we look at oil during lockdown, it's quite an interesting product. There is a lot of oil that is available, but no one is selling much and no one really wants to buy any because no one wants any. So we would say right now that there's an oversupply of oil. It's a very, very unique situation. Now let's put our knowledge to use and consider lockdown and how it's impacted the supply and demand of certain goods and services. Take a moment, pause the video, draw up a little table in a book or on a piece of paper, and see if you think that supply and demand have gone up, down, or stayed the same for these products. Let's start with Netflix. Netflix is an interesting service because it is available on the internet, which means that for the most part, the supply is basically almost infinite. That's not exactly true, but for grade 9 work, it will do. If we think about lockdown, there's also been a change in demand of Netflix. The demand has increased as people stay home and are bored and want to watch some interesting TV. Moving on to the internet, if you've been reading the news, you might have read that there actually has been a decrease in the supply of internet because so many people are trying to access the internet at the same time. This has caused the government to actually release new spectrums of bandwidth so there can be a greater supply. The reason that there is a need for a greater supply is that the demand for the internet has gone up tremendously. You as students need more internet, people at home need internet to meet with colleagues and workers, and people are using internet services more to be entertained. If we look at the next one, petrol is basically still available. It is not changing in terms of its supply, but the demand for petrol has gone down because people aren't moving from place to place to be transported. Finally, the last product you might not have paid any attention to, and you might not have even been to the store very recently. But it's interesting that in lockdown, the supply of yeast, which is used to make bread, has decreased, and you can hardly find it even till today. And this is because there's been a significant increase in demand for yeast as people who are sitting at home and bored are baking more treats more often. So that's it. We've now covered the basics of supply and demand. In the next micro lesson, we'll link it to pricing, and from there, we'll learn quite a lot about economics. Good luck.